The rain had been falling since dawn, beating hard against the narrow windows of the small cottage on the edge of Harrogate. Each drop sounded like a knock she did not want to answer. Vivian sat at the old writing desk, her back straight, her shoulders tight, her hands shaking as she held the letter she had hoped would never come. The red wax seal was unbroken no longer, but the mark pressed into it was burned into her memory. The crest of the Duke of Claremont, a symbol from a life she had buried 6 years ago. A life that had found her again. The fire crackled behind her. On the rug near the hearth, her sons played quietly with wooden soldiers. Thomas and William were 6 years old now, tall for their age, with dark hair and gray eyes so like their father's it sometimes stole her breath. They laughed softly, unaware that the world they knew was about to shatter. They did not know who they truly were. They did not know that ducal blood ran through their veins. They only knew their mother, their home, and the safety she had built with her own hands. Vivian forced herself to read the letter again. Lord Dominic Hargrave, 10th Duke of Claremont, requested her immediate presence at Claremont Hall in Derbyshire. She was to present herself within the fortnight, bringing with her the children of his late brother. There was no warmth in the words, no greeting, no question, only command. Her chest tightened as memories she had kept locked away surged back with cruel clarity. London, the whispered looks, the closed doors, Edmund's death at Waterloo. The letter that arrived 3 weeks later stained with dust and hope, begging her to seek his family's protection. Edmund had believed in honor. He had believed in his name. He had not understood what his family was capable of. Vivian had been 23 when she buried him, 23 and carrying twins. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Her hands were steadier now. 6 years of hardship had taught her that fear must never be allowed to rule her. Thomas looked up. "Mama, will you play with us?" "In a moment," she said softly, forcing a smile. She crossed the room and knelt beside them, smoothing their hair, pressing a kiss to each small head. They smelled of wood smoke and clean wool. Home. Mrs. Crawford appeared in the doorway, her lined face sharp with concern. "The boys should eat soon. Are you unwell?" "No," Vivian replied gently. "Just tired." But as she watched her sons laugh again, she knew the truth. Everything was about to change. The Duke had found them. The law would be on his side. A woman had no rights when a powerful male relative claimed children of noble blood. She could run again. She could flee farther north, but that would mark her sons forever. They would grow under suspicion, under scandal, under whispers they would not understand. No, she would go. 3 days later, the carriage stopped before Claremont Hall. Vivian stood with her sons, their small hands gripping hers tightly. The great house loomed above them, pale stone rising like a fortress. It was exactly as she remembered it. Cold, grand, unforgiving. She had married Edmund here, in a small chapel, with only 2 servants to witness their vows. The happiest day of her life, the beginning of everything she had lost. The doors opened. A tall butler regarded them with practiced indifference and led them inside. Marble floors echoed beneath their steps. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Hargraves staring down as if to judge her return. The library smelled of leather and smoke. Books towered to the ceiling. And there, standing with his back to them, was the Duke. Dominic Hargrave turned. Vivian felt her breath catch despite herself. He was older than she remembered, his dark hair touched with gray, his face marked by something harder than time. War, perhaps. His eyes were the same gray as her son's. Edmund's eyes. "Miss Sinclair," he said evenly. "Thank you for coming." She curtsied. Her sons bowed awkwardly. "Your Grace," she replied, "may I present your nephews, Thomas Edmund Hargrave and William James Hargrave." The Duke stepped closer. His gaze lingered on the boys. Something shifted in his expression, brief and unreadable. "They have my brother's eyes," he said quietly. Thomas straightened. "Mama says our papa was brave." "She speaks the truth," Dominic replied. He was the finest man I knew. Then he turned to the butler. Take the boys to Mrs. Crawford. I wish to speak with Mrs. Sinclair alone. Vivian's heart clenched, but she bent to kiss her sons. Go on. I will come soon. When the door closed, the silence felt heavy. Dominic poured brandy, but did not offer it yet. You have kept my brother's children hidden for 6 years, he said calmly. You denied them their name, their family. Why? The restraint in his voice ignited something fierce inside her. Denied them, she said sharply. I fed them, taught them, loved them. I worked until my hands bled to give them a life. Your family denied them. Your aunt sent me away with nothing but threats. His jaw tightened. You spoke to Lady Henrietta? Yes, Vivian said. I was young, alone. She told me my marriage would never be accepted, that my children would be taken if I dared claim them. I believed her. The law would have supported her. Before he could respond, the library door opened. Lady Henrietta entered like a storm wrapped in silk. This person has no right to be here, she snapped. You should have consulted the family. This person is my brother's widow, Dominic said coldly, and the mother of his heirs. Henrietta's gaze turned cruel. Alleged heirs, we have only her word. Vivian reached into her reticule and placed the marriage papers on the table. I also have Edmund's letters. Dominic examined them closely. When he looked up, something had changed. They are genuine. They are lies, Henrietta hissed. Enough, Dominic said. Leave us. Henrietta left in fury. When the door closed, Vivian's strength faltered. Dominic guided her to a chair and pressed the brandy into her hands. I owe you an apology, he said quietly, for what my family did. She met his eyes. What do you intend to do with my sons? They must be raised here. Her chest burned. You mean to take them from me? I offer you an alternative, he replied. Marriage. The word struck like thunder. A marriage of convenience, he continued. You keep your sons, I secure the succession, and if I refuse, I will claim custody. Vivian closed her eyes. There was no choice at all. May I have time? She whispered. Until tomorrow, he said. That night, standing alone in the guest chamber, Vivian looked out at the vast estate. Somewhere below, her sons slept peacefully. She would marry the Duke, not for love, not for herself, but for them. Morning came to Claremont Hall wrapped in pale autumn light. Sun spilled through tall windows, touching polished floors and heavy drapes, as if nothing in the world were uncertain. For Vivian, everything was uncertain. She had barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas and William being led away from her, their small hands reaching back, their voices calling her name. She rose before the house stirred and dressed quietly, choosing her best gown, simple and carefully mended. She would not look like a beggar pleading for mercy. She would stand as a mother defending her children. Mrs. Bob Crawford brought breakfast and tried to speak cheerfully, but her eyes held concern. His Grace wishes to see you in the morning room, she said. Vivian nodded. Thank you. The morning room was bright and warm, less severe than the library. Dominic stood by the windows, already dressed for the day, his posture straight, his expression guarded. Mrs. Sinclair, he said. Have you reached a decision? I have, Vivian replied, meeting his gaze. I will marry you, but I have conditions. His brow lifted slightly. Go on. My sons will never be separated from me, she said firmly. I will be involved in every decision that concerns them. Agreed, he said at once. Second, I will not be subjected to cruelty from your family. I require your protection. You have it, Dominic replied, his voice hardening. Anyone who disrespects you will answer to me. And third, she said more quietly, this marriage must be built on respect. I will not be treated as an inconvenience. For the first time, something like a faint smile touched his face. You are more direct than most women of your station. I have had no choice but to be, she said. Very well, Dominic said. I accept. He paused, then added, I ask one thing in return. This marriage will be real. We will live as husband and wife. Heat rose in her cheeks, but she nodded. I understand. The wedding was arranged swiftly. 3 weeks later, Vivian stood once again in the small chapel on the Claremont grounds. The air smelled of autumn flowers and candle wax. Her sons sat in the front pew, their feet swinging slightly, their faces solemn. Dominic waited at the altar, tall and composed. When their eyes met, something steadied inside her. This man did not offer love, but he offered safety. They spoke their vows clearly. When he placed the ring on her finger, his hand was warm and steady. You are now the Duchess of Claremont, the vicar declared. The words felt unreal. The days that followed passed in a blur. Dressmakers arrived from London. Servants addressed her as, Your Grace. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized. Dominic was unfailingly courteous. He ensured the boys were comfortable. He walked the estate with them, speaking of land and duty, explaining what it meant to belong to something larger than oneself. At night, the distance between husband and wife remained. They spoke quietly, cautiously, like strangers sharing borrowed space. Yet beneath the formality, something shifted. One evening, as they dined alone, Dominic surprised her. Tell me about Edmund, he said. The name struck deep. She hesitated, then spoke. She told him of Edmund's laughter, his hope, his belief that love could conquer anything. He believed deeply, Dominic said. I envied that. You still could, she replied gently. He studied her, thoughtful, then changed the subject. But the air between them felt different after that. The wedding night came quietly. Vivian sat at her dressing table, her heart racing. Dominic entered and stopped near the door. I will not force anything, he said. If you wish to wait, I will respect that. She turned to him, surprised by his restraint. I am tired of being alone, she said softly. He crossed the room then, slowly, as if giving her time to change her mind. When he kissed her, it was careful, almost tentative, but something real stirred between them. In the weeks that followed, Claremont Hall softened. Laughter returned to its halls. The boys thrived. They began to call Dominic Papa, unsure at first, then with growing ease. Vivian watched him with them and felt something warm and dangerous bloom in her chest. Then came London. The house on Grosvenor Square opened its doors, and society arrived with sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Vivian felt the weight of every glance, every whisper. Lady Henrietta appeared like a storm cloud. She did not hide her disdain. London will never accept her, she said, loudly enough for others to hear. Dominic did not hesitate. Then London will learn, he replied coldly. The first ball of the season arrived like a test. Vivian wore deep blue silk. Dominic took her hand and did not let go. Whispers followed them across the ballroom. Then Henrietta struck. She questioned Vivian's marriage. She questioned the children. Before Vivian could speak, Dominic stepped forward. His voice cut through the room. My brother's marriage was lawful. His children are legitimate. Any man or woman who doubts this questions my honor. The room stilled. Then Edmund's former officers stepped forward. They spoke of letters, portraits, of Edmund's pride in his wife and children. The tide turned. Henrietta's face went pale. Leave, Dominic said. You are no longer welcome in my family. She fled, her power broken. Dominic turned to Vivian and held her close. You are safe, he said. As they danced that night, surrounded by music and light, Vivian felt it then, clear and undeniable. She loved him, and when she whispered it, his breath caught. So do I, he said. The marriage that began in fear had become something else entirely. But even as joy bloomed, Vivian knew their story was not finished. Love had been claimed. Now it would be tested. Winter settled over England with quiet certainty. Snow dusted the grounds of Claremont Hall, softening sharp edges and muffling old echoes. Inside the great house, warmth had returned. Fires burned low and steady. Laughter moved through rooms that once felt cold and distant. Vivian had begun to believe the hardest part was behind them. She was wrong. London had accepted her, but acceptance was fragile. It rested on Dominic's strength, on public loyalty, on silence from powerful mouths. And Lady Henrietta was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. The first sign came as a letter. It arrived one gray morning, sealed and unsigned. Vivian read it alone in the morning room while the boys were at lessons. The words were polite, almost kind, but beneath them lay threat. Questions were being raised again, about dates, about witnesses, about whether Edmund's marriage could truly stand scrutiny if examined closely enough. Vivian folded the letter with shaking hands. When Dominic returned from the estate offices, she showed it to him. His jaw tightened. "She is testing us." "She will not stop," Vivian said quietly. "She wants to destroy us." "She will fail," Dominic replied. "I will not allow her to touch you or the children." But power did not always strike openly. It whispered. It waited. The rumors began, slowly. A glance held too long. A conversation that stopped when Vivian entered a room. Invitations that did not arrive. Thomas came home one afternoon unusually quiet. "Papa," he said after a long pause. A boy said Mama was not a real duchess. The words cut deeper than any insult aimed at Vivian herself. Dominic knelt before him, his voice calm but firm. "People say cruel things when they are afraid or jealous. Your mother is my wife. That is truth. Nothing else matters." That night, Vivian cried for the first time since her wedding. Dominic held her without words. "We cannot hide forever," she said. "We must end this." And so Dominic made a decision that would either destroy them or secure their future completely.
He called for a formal inquiry.
Not a defense, a declaration. He demanded that Edmund's marriage records be entered publicly into the family archives, witnessed by the church and recognized by the Crown's legal counsel. He invited scrutiny. He invited judgment. Society gasped. Lady Henrietta smiled. The day of the inquiry dawned cold and clear. Vivian stood beside Dominic in the great hall, her spine straight, her heart pounding. The boys sat with Mrs. Crawford, their faces pale but brave. Witnesses came forward. The curate who had married her and Edmund, older now, but firm in memory. The servants who had signed the registry. The officers who had known Edmund best. Letters were read, dates confirmed, ink examined, signatures compared. Hour by hour, the truth stood unbroken. Lady Henrietta spoke last. She was calm, controlled, sharp as ever. She questioned motives. She questioned character. She questioned Vivian herself. "Why did you disappear?" she asked coldly, "if you had nothing to hide?" Vivian stood. Her voice did not shake. "Yeah! I disappeared because I was threatened," she said. "Because I was told my children would be taken from me. Because I was young and alone and afraid. I did not hide from shame. I hid from cruelty." Silence filled the hall. The final judgment was clear. The marriage was lawful, the children legitimate. Lady Henrietta's objections were dismissed. Her influence shattered. When it was over, Dominic took Vivian's hand and did not let go. "It is finished," he said. And this time, she believed him. Spring returned slowly. With it came peace. The whispers faded. Invitations returned. Heads bowed lower. Smiles grew warmer. But the greatest change was not in society. It was at home. Dominic no longer guarded his heart so tightly. He laughed more. He spoke freely. He sought Vivian's counsel not from duty, but from trust. They walked the estate together, planned improvements, read side by side in the evenings, and one quiet night, as snow melted into soft rain, Vivian realized she was with child. Fear touched her first, then wonder. When she told Dominic, his breath left him as if struck. "A child," he said softly. "Our child," she replied. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if the world itself might try to steal this joy. Months passed in gentle expectation. Thomas and William hovered protectively, already proud. When the baby came, it was in early summer, as roses bloomed outside the windows. A daughter. They named her Rose Margaret Hargrave. Vivian watched Dominic hold his child, his hands careful, his eyes bright with awe, and knew then that the man who once believed himself incapable of love had been wrong. Love had simply been waiting. Years later, a portrait was hung in the Claremont gallery. The Duke and Duchess stood together, Thomas and William beside them, Rose in Vivian's arms, a family forged not by ease, but by choice. One evening, as the children slept and the house settled into quiet, Vivian and Dominic stood before that portrait. "I never imagined this life," Vivian said softly. "Neither did I," Dominic replied, "but I would choose it again, every time." She turned to him, her heart full. From a widow hiding in fear to a woman who had claimed love twice. From a duke bound by duty to a man reborn by family. Their story had begun in loss, but it ended in something far greater: belonging, love, home.